Hi, I'm Vermont State Senator Keisha Hinsdale, and this is my 16-month-old daughter, Mira. We're here to tell you that there's nothing more important to your freedoms than the right to vote. When you think about your ancestors and those who came before you, many of them fought, lost opportunity, and in some cases lost their lives so that you could participate in democracy and the peaceful transfer of power. And for those forces that are anti-democracy and against you having your fundamental rights, they'd much rather that you give up your right to vote voluntarily because you don't think it's important than that they have to take it from you by force. So just keep in mind, someone like me, the first woman of color to serve in the Vermont State Senate, now sitting at the head of the table in the Economic Development Committee, I'm able to really change and shape the agenda. Someone like me, a young pregnant woman, we're very rare in politics these days. We don't make up a big percentage of elected officials. But if you think about who makes laws about whose bodies, then women around the age of 35 who, especially women of color and women with immigrant backgrounds, make up a vast majority of who laws are made about. So please just keep in mind that if you aren't given a seat at the table or you don't take one yourself, then you end up on the menu. And remember to exercise your right to vote from the local all the way to the national.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saving Democracy Together. I'm Abrar Orpon. I'm a junior. I study computer science and public action at Bennington College. And honestly, I couldn't be more excited about this course. When I tell you, I have witnessed the collapse of democracy firsthand, and I am witnessing the ongoing efforts of rebuilding democracy in my home country, in Bangladesh. And I know firsthand how crucial it is for young people to join and to vote and engage in shaping our future. So as an international student, I cannot vote in the US, but I have dedicated my work to increase the civic engagement, to encourage people to vote. So I have created a website, it's myballot.info, which helps to make election information available and accessible to everyone, everywhere. And access to information, voting information, is very easy in myballot.info because you don't have to put any of your personal information, your name, your emails, nothing. And I just look forward to learning from all of you and having insightful discussions. And believe me, it is far easy to cast your ballot, to strengthen the democracy, and to have it sustain than to rebuild it from scratch, which I am experiencing firsthand. So once again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited for what's to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abrar. On behalf of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College, we welcome you all in person and online to our Saving Democracy Together class as part of our Patrick J. Leahy Public Policy Forum. We are truly excited that you're all participating. Our youngest participant is 16 years old online, and our oldest participant is 84 years old. We are up to about 200 altogether, so this is a real experiment for us, and we want to make it truly meaningful for all of you here in person, but also for people who are on Zoom right now. We really want you to feel that you're building a community with us, and so we will be contacting you on Fridays with readings, and we encourage you to get in touch with us with the link that we've sent you, because we will engage. I can think of nothing more important right now than to be doing this kind of work. I think we've heard over and over again how important this election is in November, but if we could inspire, in particular, 50% more young people to register and vote in this country, it really could make the difference. So we're going to have a plan of action at the end of this. We'll have a plan of action at the end of each week, and I just hope that we can all be inspired to really do something, because I think for most of us, we kind of know the outcome of the election that we want, and we're going to have to work hard to make that happen. I'd like to introduce to you the 4 teachers that you're going to have in the next 7 weeks. So if they could come up just for 1 second and be on screen so you can see them, and they're accessible. So we have Eileen Scully, who's professor of history, Brian Campion, who introduced himself, state senator and director of our public policy programs, and Maurice Hall, our wonderful provost of Bennington College. It's very exciting. As I will introduce shortly, our president is also involved, so this is a real group effort from student to administration to faculty at Bennington College. This is a webinar for the people online. You can do a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions. We will also be taking questions from our in-person participants. Tonight, because we have so much going on, there will not be a lot of time for questions from both groups, but starting next week, the programs will not be quite so complex, and we will have much more time for students to engage with questions and for our other participants to engage. We particularly, as I said, want to engage Gen Z and young people. So please feel free to give us feedback about whether this is working for you, how would you be engaged. This is not to neglect at all ages. Like I said, we have a variety of ages here and online, but we know that Gen Z is not, in general, coming out in numbers and voting. With that, I'm going to introduce the president of Bennington College, Laura Walker, who will be our moderator tonight and will be engaging with a wonderful guest, Richard Haass, who she will introduce, as well as 4 amazing alums and students that I know you will be very moved by what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And welcome again on behalf of the college to all of you students, community members, and those of you on Zoom. We are delighted to have you. First, I'd like to thank our generous alumna and board member, Ellen Sapphire, who is providing essential funding for this series. She and we believe that one of the most critical things a college must do is to educate for democracy. This commitment is captured in our mission, which says we work toward a world more beautiful, sustainable, democratic, and just. Tonight's focus is, as Susan said, on Gen Z, Americans born since 1997. They represent the largest and most diverse population in American history. Gen Z and millennial voters are actually becoming the majority of the voting population. Yet, according to recent studies, they often feel fatalistic about the role of government and removed from our democracy. So I'm going to give you a little quiz to see what we all know about civics education. And first of all, did you know that only 1 in 3 Americans can pass the US citizenship test? Here are 3 of the questions from it. What year was the Constitution written? You don't have 1787. How many amendments to the Constitution are there? 27. If the president and vice president can't serve, who becomes president? Speaker of the House. I'm not taking scores. But our guest tonight, Dr. Richard Haass, argues that too many people, including Gen Zers, lack even basic civic education. He wants to change that. Dr. Haass is a veteran diplomat, respected scholar, and tireless advocate for civic engagement and democracy. He's the author of more than a dozen books on foreign policy and politics, including his recent work called The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. This book has sparked important conversations about citizenship and the future of American democracy. Dr. Haass is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the preeminent, independent, nonpartisan organization in the United States dedicated to the study of American foreign policy. He served as its president for 2 decades. His extensive career in public service includes roles as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State, Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush, and U.S. Coordinator for Policy toward Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Haass. Can't see him. Richard, are you there?
I am here.
Hey, how are you, Richard? Great to
Good,
see
Laura.
you. Great to see you. Thank you so much. I'm going to kick it off with a question, and then I'm going to turn to our students to continue asking questions. Richard, in your book, you argue that rights alone can't sustain a democracy. And in the book, you've identified 10 key obligations for good citizens, including be informed, value norms, and promote the common good. Can you elaborate a little bit on why you believe obligations are critical and as critical as rights toward our democracy?
Well, sure. As we like to say, glad you asked me that question. Let me just also say, I think what you're doing in this tonight and in this series is just what's needed. So thank you, and my congrats to you and your colleagues there. I'm only sorry I'm not with you physically. Look, don't get me wrong, rights are essential. If you ask people to free associate with the word democracy, the word rights would, I expect, show up pretty early on in the process. Indeed, when you think about it, we only got the Constitution you just mentioned in 1987 when we passed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Several states conditioned their willingness to ratify this second Constitution. First Constitution is probably one of those questions on the test with the Articles of Confederation. They proved inadequate to the task. So this new Constitution created a much more powerful executive branch with and a federal government. And a lot of Americans were wary of it. So we created all sorts of rights. And that's, again, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The problem with rights, though, I would say, is not that they're not necessary. They're simply not sufficient. If rights only are concerned, well, what happens when they turn into absolutes? And then, inevitably, rights conflict. I mean, think about it. Take one of the most powerful debates in American politics today, that of abortion and a woman's right to choose. Well, at what point does that come into conflict with the rights of the unborn and what the society would say the extension of rights there? Or we just had the awful shooting in Georgia in a school this week. Okay, so we have Second Amendment rights pursuant to the Second Amendment. But what about the rights to safety? Well, we just went through COVID. Again, rights to public health versus individual rights, say not to wear a mask or not to get vaccinated, and so forth. So what we've learned is that rights alone do not a democracy make. And my argument is we need to balance them or join them with obligations of two sorts. One is obligations of everyone physically or on Zoom here tonight to one another. What do we all owe one another? And second of all, what do we all owe this country of ours? So what I've put forward are 10 obligations alongside our many rights. And the obligation, you mentioned 3 of them, but essentially obligations, things like getting informed, being involved, both of which are highly relevant, say over the next 60 days in the run up to the election. We have obligations that are very central to conditions on a campus, things like civility and openness to compromise, an embrace of nonviolence, some respect and looking out for the common good and for norms, and so forth. So what I'm trying to do, again, is broaden this conception of citizenship, broaden the conversation on our campuses and in this country about how we balance our individual rights with how we also balance, again, our obligations to one another and to the collective.
Thank you. One of the rights that the obligations that you talk about is to value norms. And I thought that was really interesting. And you define norms as the unwritten traditions, rules, customs, conventions, codes of conduct, and practices that reduce friction and brittleness in a society. How are we doing on that? And how do we have the kind of discussion in this country in order to agree on what norms we want?
Well, if we were doing really well, I wouldn't have had to single it out. The most obvious norm and one of the really hallmarks or distinguishing features of American democracy until recently was the peaceful transfer of power. I always thought one of the most dramatic displays or demonstrations of American democracy was the drive down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol steps, when the outgoing president and the incoming president would go together in the limo. And you then have the ceremony and so forth. And clearly that has gone by the wayside. I think every society has its norms. Laws only take you so far. It's almost the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. We have all sorts of norms in a society. There's no requirement. There's no law that, for example, one should contribute something to charity, that one should look out for one's fellow citizen. That's clearly a norm. That's one of those unwritten rules that if we're in a position to help others, we ought to do it. I'm not familiar, obviously, with Bennington, but I expect you've got your formal rules about conduct in the classroom, on the campus, and so forth. But you can't imagine, you can't articulate every conceivable situation that might come up. And that's where norms kick in. What are your expectations about how students relate to one another, how faculty and staff relate to students, and so forth? And that's why I think norms are so important to the social contract.
I think that's really powerful. How do you actually have that conversation in this country? We do have a lot of norms that we do, observe, but there are things, obviously, your example is an incredibly powerful one about the transition of power. Even how we treat each other, what language people use, how do we have that conversation in a way that can move us forward?
And it's difficult because by definition, norms are things you can't require. So you're asking people to voluntarily put them into practice. I mean, another one might be transparency about one's finances if you're seeking public office, that if you're seeking public office, you get special authority. Well, we who you have authority over, I would say, have an interest in your taxes or your financial situation. Yeah, we don't require it. But one way to increase the willingness to abide by norms is that we as citizens require it. We'll say, look, I'll only vote for you if you do certain things. I want you to show respect to others. I want you to reveal you make your taxes open and so forth. I think that we as citizens, again, whether we're talking about the country or again life on a campus, we can hold people accountable and we can say, look, this may go beyond the law, but we're going to expect that. And if you're not prepared to go to meet this, then there will be consequences.
Yeah, thank you. Before I turn it over to the students, I'm going to ask you one last question. You've obviously spent most of your career, a lot of your career on foreign policy, and you've witnessed many different kinds of governance around the world, as our students have. How have these experiences shaped your view of the rights and the obligations here in this country? And I know that's a pretty big question, but if you can just give us a sense of how that's shaped your sense of who we are.
Look, it's a big question. I'll try to do justice to it. One is I don't take American democracy for granted. Here we are, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary in 2026 of this experiment, this great experiment. We're the world's oldest democracy. Well, that in and of itself sends the signal that this is not the natural way of things. It's certainly not the inevitable way of things. The democracies are hard. They're difficult. You know, they can come in many forms. We have parliamentary democracies, presidential democracies, hybrid democracies. We have our own. I think they're valuable. I think democracies do respect rights and protect rights of assembly, speech, religion, what have you. I think democracies also go hand in hand, traditionally with innovation, economic performance, where you have the ability to start a business, you have the ability to traffic in ideas. You know, all these things are really good. So I think democracies have real advantages, but also democracies, again, they're not automatic. They're not self-perpetuating. They can break down. I mean, the biggest threat to democracies, it turns out, is not foreign invasion, though that can be a threat, as we see, say, with Ukraine, or we saw with Israel on October 7th. But the biggest threat to democracies historically is from within. When they lose sight of what makes them work. And that's, again, you know, what motivated me here, to be honest, is as we, you know, reach the 250-year mark, I've become uneasy with the state of American democracy. So I wrote this in part to what? Trigger something or stimulate something of a conversation or a dialogue in campuses, in classrooms, on town halls, around the country, to get Americans to understand what are the advantages of democracy, what does it take for democracy to survive, not just what does democracy owe us, but almost to channel John F. Kennedy, what can we do for our country, what can we do for one another. But I think what travel does around the world is it shows you all the various forms of government and alternatives to democracy, and why, by and large, I find them wanting. But just because that's the case doesn't mean that we necessarily do well. Just because others do badly doesn't mean we do well. To do well is on us, and I really do think it's up to each generation to understand that. And I worry, quite honestly, in this country now, we've lost sight of that. It's one of the reasons I bang the drum so often of civics education, that I think we've got to be much more systematic and purposeful about making sure that our high school and college students get exposed to this kind of a conversation. It's why I'm such a great believer also in public service, if not necessarily as a career. I really want every young person, or not so young person, to have a stint in public service. It can be the military, it can be intelligence, it can be the foreign service, it can be the Peace Corps, it could be Teach for America, the new Climate Corps. There's all sorts of things that we can do at the state and federal level. And I think what's so good about public service is you give back, you also learn. But what I like about it more than anything is it brings Americans together. To use a university example, it's almost right. The country's becoming siloed like academic departments. So I worry about students who go through a university or college, and the people studying science don't study humanities or what have you. Well, I worry in this country that people in certain states or cities or towns go to the same churches and watch the same cable shows and so forth, and don't meet people who are different. They don't have common experiences. And over time, that really breaks down American society. So one of the wonderful things about public service is it brings Americans together who would normally not come to know and live with and work with one another. So I would really hope that the talented young people who leave Bennington, whether afterwards or at some point in the course of their lives, they really think hard and hopefully agree to do, whether it's a year, 2 years, what have you, of government service.
Yeah, well, thank you. And you are sparking conversation and I hope interest in foreign service here. And when you were talking about the threat to democracy coming from within, many of our students who have experienced that were nodding their heads. And so now I want to turn it over to 4 remarkable individuals. They're 2 alums who graduated last year, right? Oh, no, yeah, and 2 current students. Marta Sharbakova, right? Marta Sharbakova. I know her as Marta, recent alum from Belarus. Samuel de Souza, a recent alum from Venezuela. Paige Colby, a current student from the United States. And Abrar Arpan, who you heard earlier, from Bangladesh. So Marta, would you kick it off?
Thank you. It was 9 p.m. in Zhodina prison in Belarus, and the guard switched yellow daylight to the pale blue one, turning day into night in a span of a second. From under the blanket on top level of my bunk bed, I gazed at blue light, casting long slanted shadows onto the walls of the cell. Soon my eyes shut, and I realized that I was in the heart of my country with the like-minded people next to me. I could be in Bennington College right now, but I'm here in jail, exactly where I'm supposed to be. Susan Sgarbati last month has asked me to speak about my experience of democracy. And I'm afraid that I will not be able to deliver exactly that because I have never been a citizen of democracy myself. I've already been introduced. I studied visual art here at Bennington College. And I'm here to share with you my story. The great Russian literature writer and lyricist Alexander Pushkin once said, "Habitual behavior, habits, as a phenomena, has been bestowed to us from the beyond as a substitute for happiness. People's superpower and their great flaw, I agree, are those of capacity to adapt. We can get used to anything. If the life is constantly comfortable and blissful, we grow accustomed to bliss. We take a lot for granted. If the life is unjust and repressive, we anticipate repression. Sometimes the comfortable life gives us opportunities to work really, really hard. But sometimes it does make us complacent. And the life of injustice can really, really hurt and make us want to resist so that our dignity is restored. My story really began in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell and the Republic of Belarus rose. In 1994, the Belarusians, for the first time and the last time, have elected their young and unexperienced representative of the Communist Party as their president. His name, Alexander Lukashenko. Alexander Lukashenko quickly acted on his contra-constitutional strategies in favor of Russification, which disguised his secret ambitions to one day step into Boris Yeltsin's place as the head of new Russian empire. Belarusian opposition members and anybody who spoke out against his anti-constitutional measurements slowly started to disappear, one by one. The majority of the population did condemn Lukashenko's politics inside the safety of their kitchen homes. But few acted against the severe threat that he posed for the newly planted seed of the Belarusian democracy. which was only 4 years old. Within a few years, Lukashenko dug out that seed before it had a chance to sprout. Some citizens, of course, adjusted to the new reality and chose passive safety. However, some secretly began plowing the soil for the new generation of dreamers to sprout. My parents nurtured the sense of freedom of thought and word in me by allowing room for a little bit of healthy mischief. I started testing out my limits at school by forgetting at home my little octobrist communist star-shaped badge, or skipping war parades, or, soon enough, attending my first anti-governmental protest. You must imagine the adrenaline rush of passing the rows of anonymous black suits, waiting for command to arrest you. With time, the regime spread like a virus, and the anonymous walls of soldiers began to implode, cornering the protesters in the center. People were faced with a choice: to either give in and accept, or to push back, which one could never do alone. A massive unison of strangers' voices flooded the streets in synchronized chanting. We looked around and quickly realized that the dictatorship and the anger had gone completely on the background, and it was just a large celebration of courage, of us. I know it was easy to make relationship with politics while living under authoritarian regime. It was black and white, good and evil. It had a face, a sound, but most importantly, it was easy and essential to make relationships with the neighborhoods, with the aunts and uncles and parents, with the rogue teachers. Yes, nothing unites a people more than a shared goal. Are you jealous yet? Because I had a wonderfully exuberant childhood. I have been blessed by life with a dangerously noble problem and plenty of opportunities to find out what I am made of. Have you? Good evening, Dr. Haass. I believe you're here, and I have a question for you, which you've partly started to speak about and answer already, about the threat of, for the US democracy. And you said that it's not the external one, that of Russia or China or North Korea, but an internal one, which is from ourselves. It appears that the United States has fallen into polarizing groups of absolutist truths. How do you think each of us can foster a sense of unity in this country, and where would you start?
Well,
Thank
first
you.
of all, Marta, I feel somewhat humbled by having listened to you. That was extraordinary.
Thank
And,
you.
and I particularly just wanted to say I think you used the word exhilarating or exuberant. The idea of getting involved, knowing why you're involved, taking risks, making a difference. Good for you. That's special, and it's just really impressive. So, really good for you. And it's also wonderful that you're safe and you're well, and you can share that here with us tonight. So thank you for that. The question of what individuals can do. Well, first of all, they can do things. I mean, you've just talked about in your context in Belarus. Uh, Here I begin with a university or college campus is the perfect place to start, is to get informed. Understand there's no substitute for that. It's interesting, Thomas Jefferson argued persuasively that the most important thing a citizen can do is be informed. And he argued that if he was forced to choose, among other things, between a free press and a government, he would choose the free press. Access to accurate information. So we have the opportunity to get informed. So that is one thing. To get involved, not to be passive. Democracy is not a spectator sport. If one sits on the sidelines, then others will decide what the future of the society is, what the future of the political system is, and they may not be committed to democracy. So I think there's a real case for getting involved. And again, it's the reason I talked about such things as in this society there's no political cause that justifies violence. And it doesn't mean one is, and just to be clear, to rule out violence doesn't mean one accepts an imperfect or unjust status quo. If one looks at Martin Luther King in this country, if one looks at the tradition of Thoreau on Walden Pond, the whole idea is one has the right to protest, to object to what is seen as an unjust law. But one also accepts the consequences. Well, one is not acting in a revolutionary way to overthrow the system. One is acting within the system to see that it lives up to its own principles. And I think that is important. But I would say, given the context here tonight, we're talking, to people in academic community, get informed, get involved. We've got I would argue, one of the most critical elections in the history of this country right now. We have choices that are profound. And this is not a time come November 6th to wake up and say, gee, I wish I had done this. This is a time to get involved. And I mentioned in the course of one's life, to do things like public service. You talk about unity. Well, that's a really important way to do it, to get to understand that one's fellow citizen, that despite the differences, to reach out to them, to have conversations with them. Whether, again, and one can start on campus. Like, I don't mean to go on so long, but look what's happened to American campuses over the last year. The intensity of the political disagreements. And in many cases, those disagreements deteriorated into shouting matches, shouting down people, shouting over people, into violence, into destroying property. So a pretty good way to learn how to disagree in a democracy, how to debate, and so forth. Well, you're in a place where that ought to happen. I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. I'm almost tempted to write one saying democracy begins at home. And I think there's a real opportunity at places such as Bennington, and then beyond. I would hope that just being a student is not the totality of one's life. It's a dimension of it. One is also a citizen, whether it's in this country or other countries. So I would say get involved and work for what you believe in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Haass. It is my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Samuel de Sousa, to this podium.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here. And I want to start by saying that it is extremely beautiful for me to see how many people are engaged, coming from Venezuela and living under a dictatorship and just seeing democracy decline my whole life. It has been my biggest frustration abroad, just to see people not taking advantage of those spaces, of that freedom, and taking that for granted, especially young people, sadly. And I think we only learn from the evils we suffer ourselves, but hopefully here we can transmit a little bit of our experiences for you to know that no one is safe, and democracy is only as good as we make it. And I came here to say a few things, and one of them is that once a problem starts to hit your door, then you cannot ignore them. I know this is very cheesy, and we hear about it, that you need privileges for you to not engage, but it is true. In my case, it was true. My parents were born in a democracy in 1960 in Venezuela, a very new democracy back then. It lasted for 40 years, and then when I was born, when a populist was elected, Hugo Chavez, then it started to decline. My parents sometimes voted, they barely engaged. They were having a happy middle class life. They didn't need to until we needed to. And for me, it's very important for people to know that it's easier, as Abrar said earlier on, to strengthen a democracy, to protect a democracy, than to recover it. We just did something glorious in July, as maybe you saw on the news. After 24 years under an authoritarian regime that is now flirting with totalitarianism, we went to the polls in an election that was going to be rigged, knowing the results were not going to be respected, knowing thousands of people risked being detained, and they did, including a cousin of mine, including activists I met when I went back to do research for my thesis. And it is extremely important to know that if you have that freedom, you should use it. I really don't understand when people don't. So it makes me really, really happy to see everyone here. This is a great starting point, and I hope you all continue to engage in the various ways you can. If democracy is not working, then fix it. Democracy is the government of the people, and we are the people. If we are not governing, someone else will, and that might be a dictator one day, and then you will not have that platform anymore. If you're unsatisfied because corporate interest captured both parties, or at least a lot of elected politicians' policies, then fight harder, organize. Grassroots movements are pushing back. Don't let measures like Citizens United let the NRA or oil companies decide for you. Voting might not be enough. If you're unsatisfied and you want to denounce that the US government is funding a genocide, then vote for progressives in Congress. If you are unhappy because weed hasn't been legalized nationwide, you can vote for that directly in 3 states in November. You can vote for that for abortion rights directly, you as a citizen. So there, in those cases, there is not even the excuse of the lesser of the two evils. I don't like that choice. No, you are voting for the policy directly. And you can vote at so many levels. There is so much freedom here. Is it a perfect democracy? It's not. It's a flawed democracy, even according to, if I'm not mistaken, The Economist ranking, democracy index, or one democracy index, I can't remember right now. But there is still that space for you to engage without being detained. That being said, it's not only a duty, there is so much joy in it. It's so beautiful, that passion of organizing, of debating. Marta and I became close bonding first here because we had that common experience. And we went to bed so many times at like 3 a.m. as roommates, debating all of our differences, and there was nothing better than that. And that just made our friendship stronger, and that is democracy, and there is nothing better than that. That is living the human experience in its peak. We're political beings. And if we don't do that, it's such a waste, and it's so sad. It really makes me sad to see humans just alienated from the public spheres. We're not like other animal species. And I think what makes us different is the fact that we can engage politically. So why wouldn't you? That would be my question. And I wanted to ask Dr. Haass, which I'm honored to have here. I really admire your work, first of all, and your nuanced opinions and analyses. I really enjoy hearing them. And I wanted to ask for you to elaborate on your call on for public action that goes beyond voting. I think, at least for me, I cannot vote in the US, but I do want to engage more, but sometimes it's hard to. And I don't know if you have examples you want to highlight of maybe organizations or strategies. I know you have mentioned that a little bit already, being informed. But yeah, I wanted to know if you had more things to guide us engage, especially the younger generation that might be unsatisfied with the status quo and might feel like voting is not, that we don't have great choices.
First of all, thank you. Let me also say one or two things about Venezuela, because I visited quite a few times in various stages of its history. And I did so as a private citizen and also as a government official, as a State Department official, and had long meetings, among other things, with Mr. Chavez and others. Venezuela is a warning for those who aren't familiar with the country. Venezuela, in many ways, had it all. A really well-educated, many well-educated people in the society, tremendous wealth. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, if one includes all the oil sands and the like. It was a vibrant economy. Yes, there were problems. There was economic inequality, I understand. There was some corruption and so forth. But Venezuela was a thriving, robust economy and democracy. And here we are, what, 2 decades later? And it's anything but. And we just had an election that was stolen. 2/3 of the people voted for change, and the government simply ignored it and acted. The only word that comes to mind is impunity. It nakedly ignored the results of an election and essentially dared the world to do something about it. And the world is trying to think about what could make a difference, what could promote the forces of democracy there. It's a complicated foreign policy issue. But my point is simply, to me, Venezuela is a little bit of a warning in the sense that it demonstrates that democracies, it's almost like a garden, take constant tending, constant care. And if you ignore it at your own peril. You ignore it, and that's even true of us. We're an older democracy. But again, I think what recent years have shown is we take it for granted. We ignore challenges to it at our peril. And there is a vulnerability. If people get alienated enough, then people, they become vulnerable to the promises of populism. And then they're willing to put aside democracy for certain policies. And that is a dangerous path to go down. And, it's a foreign policy conversation now about how to try, as you said, I think you made a really thoughtful point. Much better to protect the democracy than recover it. I often write about in foreign policy, it's much better to defend a country than liberate it. And what you've described is the political equivalent of it. I think it's wise, and I think it's true. So for Venezuela, the challenge is recovering democracy. For us, it's the challenge of protecting democracy, and we ought to take it seriously. Your question's a really good one. Look, there's lots of ways to make a difference. I'm very fond of talking about civil society, where Americans form groups, form efforts, which make a difference. I mean, take a simple one that we don't think of as political: Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We used to have, where alcohol-related accidents were commonplace. Well, we had this citizen group started, literally by mothers who had lost family members. And look at the difference in the United States. We still have far too many deaths on highways, but we now have seatbelts. We have much tighter laws against drinking and driving and so forth. So things would be far, far worse had it not been for this citizen initiative. In other parts of the country, we see, you mentioned the flaws in democracy here. Well, one of the flaws is what's called gerrymandering, the artificial drawing of districts in order to bias them in favor of certain political outcomes. Well, in certain states, we've had citizen initiatives to depoliticize the process of drawing borders for state houses of in legislatures. On the gun control debate, on both sides of the debate, you have citizen groups that are engaged. Same thing when it comes to abortion debate. So what I like about American politics is there's many entry points. And yes, we have the entry point of voting at the ballot box, and that's an essential one. It's a unique one. It's a critical one, but it's not the only one. And so I would hope, and again, when I was at school 400 years ago, the Vietnam War was central. And so we had teach-ins, and the whole idea was to educate students about what was going on and so forth. And now, obviously, we have any number of wars going on, from the one in Ukraine to what's going on in the Middle East and so forth. But there's a chance to get involved and to educate. So I just think that, particularly if you're a non-citizen, you don't have the right to vote here. And in your own country, in many cases, you're denied right to vote. But there are ways to get involved and to make a difference. And I think also what you and Marta and others do is they bring a kind of perspective. You've got, what you say is quite powerful, because Americans naturally and understandably take democracy for granted. It's the only thing we've known. So I think it's really good for young Americans to hear from people who have had experiences, whether it's in Belarus or Venezuela or what have you, where they learn not to take something that is precious for granted. So I encourage you to keep speaking out. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haass. Thank you. Now I'll introduce my great friend, Paige Colby.
Thank you, Samuel. Hi, everyone. As Samuel said, I'm Paige Colby. I'm currently a senior at Bennington College studying society, culture, and thought in the advancement of public action. I'd like to think I'm here speaking to you all tonight because of my campus involvement. I'm currently the president of Bennington's Planned Parenthood Gen Action chapter, and I've previously been a campus scholar for the free speech nonprofit FIRE, or the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I've been an AmeriCorps member as one of my fieldwork terms, and I've previously been a member of Bennington's Student Council. So I'm super excited to be here talking to Dr. Haass, as I've recently been reading his book, The Bill of Obligations. And so getting back to that, my question is, Dr. Haass, what do you believe is the greatest obligation young people have as citizens today?
First of all, Paige, I love what you're doing. You've got one packed resume, and Samuel asked the question of how to get involved. You're a walking, talking example of someone who's walking the walk, and you're involved in lots of different ways, from student government to various organizations. So fantastic, and I hope and expect that'll continue after you leave Bennington with a diploma under your arm. And again, one doesn't have to do this full time. One can and many will have careers that might be, one could be an engineer, one could be a doctor, a nurse, what have you, a teacher, but this can and should be a dimension of your life. So just like now you're a student, but you've got these other dimensions. So I think what you are doing is exactly right. So and now I've gone on so long, Paige, I forgot exactly what you asked me. I apologize.
No worries. I'm so flattered right now. My question again is, what is the greatest obligation that young people have as citizens?
Well, let me bookend it. The one I've already talked about is the obligation to get informed, particularly as a young person. In some ways, if you think about it, you're investing in your own life. Here you are, when you get to college, you're roughly 18, you leave college, you're roughly in your early 20s. Hopefully, God willing, you've got a half a century ahead of you to make a difference. And so what you want to do now early on is you want to tool up, you want to invest in yourself. And it's not selfish. If you want to give back, first you've got to invest. You've got to build up your capacity. So you want to get informed, you want to get skills, and so forth. So I think early on, that's the most important thing, to get informed. Indeed, I say getting informed is more basic than getting involved. As much as I want people to be involved, I don't want to be involved in an uninformed way. So the first thing is to get informed. We can have a longer conversation about how to get informed, because it's easier said than done in an age where we're drowning in misinformation. So the guidelines for getting informed, how to discern between fact and not facts, where to go, what is, we talk about cyber hygiene. Well, what's good information hygiene? What are the rules of information literacy? Turns out to be, they're teachable and they're doable, but they're not necessarily obvious. But that's the basic. The other is I go to the 10th obligation. At a national level, it's put country first. It's put country before party or person. And whether you disagree or agree with her politics, what someone like Liz Cheney has done, I would say, is exactly that. She sacrificed at times her own political career. She lost the primary in her own state. She was willing, again, this is not whether you agree with her or not, just the idea that she was willing to pay an enormous price for putting the country before her own political ambitions and her party. That's, to me, really, really impressive. And that's a model of character and good behavior. When John F. Kennedy wrote a book, when he was a senator, he wrote a book, Profiles in Courage. What he did is, if I remember correctly, he wrote 8 portraits of senators throughout history, either who resisted compromise when it meant selling out their principles or the country, or were willing to compromise, even if it meant sacrificing their own political career because it was unpopular. So I just admire that. So, and it might at Bennington also mean thinking about how you put the community there. You're citizens of a community, of a college, as well as the country. And the question is, what might that mean at times about how one determines priorities and behaviors and so forth. And I think we as citizens have the opportunity to reward those who do this. If we see behaviors that we admire and respect, people who are willing to put country before party or person, I would say let's be willing to support them, even if we disagree on some of the specifics. And it's difficult sometimes to make those choices, but at the end of the day, we get the government, we get the country we deserve, not necessarily the one we need. So I actually think, someone before, might have been Samuel, mentioned we the people. Well, that's kind of the basis. This is ultimately the nature of political life comes from the ground up, and we've got to decide what is it we're prepared to work for. So I think a lot is on us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haass. That's great. I'd like to introduce also my dear friend, Abrar.
Thanks, Paige. Before I jump into my question, I just want to give a quick context to everyone. So the autocratic government of Bangladesh was forced to resign last month on August 5th. Yes. And one of the 6 coordinators of this massive movement was actually my long-term roommate. So when I say I have a very close relation with a collapsing democracy, that's what I mean. So, so when the interim government took over after the autocratic government resigned, 2 of the 6 main coordinators were actually appointed as ministers of 2 very important, 2 very important ministries. So my question to Dr. Haass is, what do you think should the role of youth leadership be in a post-revolution government and in democracy building? And to what extent should our generation be involved, given that we may have a strong leadership quality, but we may lack the expertise in running a government or just like building a democracy from scratch? Thank you.
Interesting question. First of all, the people who run governments may not have all the expertise either. If they had more expertise, they might be doing a better job in some cases. just as an aside, one of the advantages of a democracy, I've come to think, is not that it doesn't make mistakes. Democracies make their share of mistakes, we all know. But what democracies have over the advantage they often have over the authoritarian systems is the ability to correct mistakes. The fact that authority is divided, there's oversight and so forth. Democracies seem to me have that structural advantage of self-correction, whereas authoritarian systems, often the authoritarian leader doesn't permit that, because if you question him or her on one issue today, you might get in the habit of questioning them on other issues tomorrow, which is something they don't want to see. I would think for young people to get involved is, again, to get informed. If you don't have the expertise, then read some history. And people often ask me, what's the best form of what thing to study? And I'm a great believer in history. I think there are lessons to be learned. It's not a cookbook with specific recipes, but there are lessons, parallel experiences to be learned from. There's a great literature. I mean, in my country, I really do recommend that people read the Articles of Confederation for all their flaws, read the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, read some of the critical Supreme Court decisions, read some of the great speeches. Get up to speed with relevant political history. Read about the history of democracy, why they've succeeded, why they've gone off the rails, why they have failed. And one of the things that becomes clear very often is the importance of institutions. You want to build in democracies. One of the words we often use in the climate debate turns out to be relevant to the democracy debate. You want to build resilience in a democracy. You want to give the democracies the ability to push back against anti-democratic forces, because they will arise. Indeed, when you look at American political history, the Federalist Papers, they imagined that challenges would arise. What Sam Huntington, the great political scientist, described as the man on horseback. There'll always be populist leaders in a democracy. What you want to do is build up the ability of a democracy to push back, to expose them, to stand to stand up to them. So I would say for young people, by all means, get involved, but again, do so with some humility and some appreciation of history, and don't let one's zeal or enthusiasm for the particular causes of the moment to breed intolerance, to essentially think there are shortcuts. You know, democracies are notoriously inefficient, but inefficiency also brings with it a kind of protection. It's a protection against too much concentration of power moving in ways that can trample individual rights or collective rights. So there's, I think, I would simply say, a degree of humility and a bit of appreciation for what we've learned in this and other countries about what's led to our successes and what's led to our failures.
Thank you. Great job. Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. So I don't know if anybody in the audience might have one. And I also have, looking to see if maybe we have one here, but I don't see any here. So there are. None are coming up. Yeah, we'll start with one in the audience. Yes, here, I'll bring the microphone back to you.
Hi, my name is Nora Dyer Murphy, and I have a couple questions for Dr. Haass, if that's okay. Oh, okay. I'll do with one. Okay. So in your presentation on the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, you kind of mentioned like somebody asked you about like what can we do about like the flaws in our structures in our democracy, like gerrymandering and sort of like buffering within the electoral college. And you kind of said that like those are kind of giant boulders to like push. So it'd be better if we could like push for things more like indirectly and that are a bit easier. Can you elaborate more on that, please?
Sure. No, you raise a really important point. I would like to make some big changes in our democracy. You think about it, this democracy is close to 250 years old, and we've only had 27 amendments. And the first 10 were a requirement for ratification, as it turned out. So essentially, we've had 17 other amendments over the years. That's not even one a decade. So it shows you how tough it is to make big changes. We've made changes through legislation and court decisions and the rest. We're a very different country than we are, but it's difficult. And things like the Electoral College, which I think has all sorts of unintended consequences, not all of which, I'll be gentle here, are positive. The problem with wanting to change it is that inevitably those who believe they would be disadvantaged by the change will resist it. It's very hard to change a system where there's perceived winners and losers for any proposed change. And if the losers or those who perceive they would lose from the proposed change, say in the Electoral College, states with small populations, they will resist it, and they have the power to do that. So I understand the calls for electoral reform. We may hear it again this November. It's not going to happen anytime soon, to say the least. Gerrymandering, the drawing up of districts informed by political considerations. The court has been reluctant to get involved, but it has gotten involved on occasion. And there's ways to get involved politically. Ultimately, in some states, the district lines are drawn by nonpartisan commissions. In many states, they're drawn up by state legislatures. If you don't like the way they're drawn, I would say then in some cases, the votes within a state legislature are very close. It might only take a few seats going from red to blue or blue to red to change things. So I would say focus on that. 20 years ago, state legislatures didn't look the way they look. So it's not in cement. So I think there the chances of change at the state level are better than they are at the federal level. But I'm not going to fight your basic point, particularly since it's what I said in Chicago. There are many big changes, no matter how desirable you or I might think they are, they're not going to happen. There's too much political resistance to it. So then you have to think of changes below that or around that. That's where, again, I go into some of the things I write about, because the things I'm writing about they're not boulders, they're pebbles. But ultimately, you get enough pebbles and it adds up to something. And if we can get changes in political behavior, then I think it can create a political environment where more ambitious political changes become possible. But if we try to go from where we are today to ambitious political change, I think this country is too divided, too polarized to get there, and we'll have gridlock. So I'm interested in achievable changes now, which tend to be more modest, but also more doable.
Any other questions from the audience? Somebody? Oh, yeah, we see that. Anybody else before we go to Zoom? Okay, great, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Haass, first of all, thank you for your presentation, I would call it. You mentioned a few times that public service brings people together. And could you elaborate on how public service can actually bring people together?
Sure. Well, part of the idea comes from World War II, what Tom Brokaw and others have written about as the greatest generation when we had a draft, military conscription. Millions of Americans were required to join the military, and it didn't matter if they were rich or poor, from New York and Nevada, Christian or Jewish or Muslim, educated or not. They all, and often they were in a unit with people who came from fundamentally different backgrounds, people from cities and people in rural areas. And it just broke down barriers that normally they never would have come into contact with one another. We saw that in the Peace Corps. What's happening now is we're not seeing a lot of public service at the federal level. We're not seeing too many political differences, not enough funds, but we're seeing it increasingly at the state level. California has been in the lead on this in starting up various public service initiatives. And what's happened now is several of these are being copied in other states, and several of these are being copied by the federal government. This new Climate Corps, which began as an idea in California, and now the White House has created it at the national level. And again, I think if we can make these public service opportunities attractive, why not pay people? Why not forgive student loans for public service? We have veterans benefits when it comes to getting into universities, or we had the GI Bill. I'd be all in favor of various educational benefits for people who did public service, or if someone's an employer. Right now, a lot of employers are going out to hire veterans for good reason. It'd be great though if employers said, hey, we are going to give a priority to hiring people who have done public service, because that's a good opportunity. They will get trained and they've learned how to work with people from various backgrounds. That's exactly the kind of employee we want to have in our company. So I think we've got to have more public service opportunities, make them attractive, and then we've got to find ways to reward people. And I think once that gets seen and known, then we begin to create a pipeline. And then I think we create a positive momentum. And it's one of the few areas in this divided country I'm beginning to see a degree of Democratic and Republican agreement. There's actually a caucus in Congress of members from both parties who are in favor of national service of some sort. I don't think we can have a draft. Americans don't much like compulsory things. But if we make it attractive, if we build in incentives, then I actually think we can get a lot of Americans to do it. So I'm pretty optimistic on that. Won't have immediate benefits, if you will, except for the individual. But if you do it at enough scale over enough time, then suddenly you create a pretty significant number of people who have had a constructive experience.
So we have lots of compliments online, but only one question. And the question is, Dr. Haass, the belief that the world is best off when America leads is frequently promoted, this individual feels, by you. And this notion is almost never questioned. Sometimes they wonder if this variant of American exceptionalism is logic-based, or is it just comforting and self-congratulatory? Putting you to the test as the final question. I see some students shaking their heads, yes.
Well, let me put it this way. American leadership in the world began in a sustained way in World War II in the 40s, and has largely continued for the last approximately 75 years. And I would say this has been a remarkable 75 years. Not perfect, but remarkable and quite extraordinary. Think about it. Once with the end of World War II, there has not been a direct great power conflict. When else in history can you say that the great powers of the day did not come into conflict with one another? Second of all, nuclear weapons have not been used since the end of World War II. Thirdly, we went through the process of decolonization, and a lot of entities that were colonies of Europeans and other countries have become independent. Fourthly, more people around the world are living in democratic or partially democratic political systems than any other point in human history. Fifthly, there's been more wealth created in the world by orders of magnitude than we've ever seen. Sixth, the average person lives several decades longer than they would have lived 75 years ago. Look at the inventions, the technologies that we now take for granted. I actually think it's just been an extraordinary run of history. And my view is, I've studied enough history to think that good things aren't automatic. I mean, a lot of you are, I assume, study science. And one of the things you learn in science is that the natural way of things is not systemic. It's not order, but it's entropy. It's randomness. Well, the same thing is true in international relations. The natural way of things is not the world coming together. It's not peace. It's not justice. But it's often conflict. So the fact that it's been a pretty good run of history, not perfect. We've made mistakes in Vietnam and Iraq and other places. You know, trust me, I'm fully prepared to recognize the mistakes we've made and continue to make, and the things we've done or not done. But all in all, I think that it's been a remarkable run of history. And the United States has played an outsized role in that. We haven't done it alone. We've built coalitions, we've built alliances, we've built institutions. So multilateralism has been central to this effort. And I would simply say that it's been more successful than not. And to me, when I look at history and I look at the United States, there's two dangers. And one we've seen at times in recent decades is when the United States tries to do too much, what people like me call overreach. We saw it, say, in Iraq, and that was a costly mistake. But a bigger mistake, or a more frequent mistake in American foreign policy, one we saw in the 30s, one we're seeing elements of today, is underreach, when the United States pulls back from the world in various forms of isolation. And we shouldn't think that if we do less, other benign forces fill the space. My own view is if we do less, the forces that fill the space will be malign and they'll be disorderly and anarchic. Indeed, the best book I've ever read about international relations was by a colleague of mine at Oxford named Hedley Bull, an Australian. And the title of the book is The Anarchical Society. And in that title, Anarchical Society, those are the two competing forces of history: forces of anarchy, forces of society, forces of disorder and order coexisting. And we want the balance to always be in the direction of order. And I would say over the last 75 years, the balance has been tipped in that direction. Not because that was inevitable, not because that is natural, but because of the efforts of the United States in designing and maintaining an international order. And my concern going forward for the next 75 years or 7 years or 5 years, whatever number you want, is not so much now that the United States will try to do too much, but will try to do too little. And that as a result, forces of disorder, forces of anarchy will find space and opportunity to do what they would do. So when I make this argument, it's not that the United States has always gotten it right. God knows we haven't. But more often than not, we have. And I worry about the alternative to to a large American, consistent, reliable, predictable role in the world.
We're going to leave it there. Dr. Haass, on behalf of the person who brought you to campus virtually, President Walker, and all of us here, thank you for this incredible, incredible conversation. Thank you as well to the students who participated. This has been really a remarkable evening and one that we will remember for a long time. So thank you, Dr. Haass.
Thank you all. Thank you. Be well. Thank you all.
So for the next 15 minutes, don't move. We are going to try something along with this experiment that we're doing tonight on Zoom. We are going to spend a few minutes and do something that we're calling From the Field. We are reaching out to different people around the United States to get a sense of what they're doing around the issue of preserving, strengthening our democracy. And tonight we have a recent alum, Alex, who is going to be joining us. And if Alex is here, this would be a great time for us to see Alex.
Hi, I've turned my camera on. I'm not sure.
Perfect. Alex, it's so great to see you. What we'd love you to do is just kick this off by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where you're doing it and why.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi, my name is Alexandra Burkick. I'm the Bexar County Regional Organizer for Move Texas. I'm so excited to be here with y'all tonight, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person like I had planned, but nonetheless, I'm really happy to speak with current Bennington students. And as Brian actually mentioned, I'm a recent grad. I finished my studies literally 3 months ago, so I'm part of the class of 24. Some background for myself. I'm originally from San Antonio, Texas. I got my start in politics at 16. I grew up in a neighborhood affected by gun violence, and that prompted me to become involved in violence prevention work. And throughout my time at Bennington, I also worked with Ganas, shout out Ganas, like love that student org, like everybody should join, everybody should support, plugging y'all in. And through there, I worked with Migrant Justice and their incredible campaign, Milk with Dignity. Eventually, I also got the opportunity to work as a congressional intern during my final term at Bennington, and now I'm at Move Texas. I first learned about this organization when I was 16. I received help from then Move staff on the first demonstration I'd organized, period, with March for Our Lives. And from there, I became part of their field program. More recently worked as an electoral canvasser in the Texas heat, averaging like 105, 110 every single day. And just I believe like 3 weeks ago, I became the Bexar County organizer. And MOVE is an organization that was started in 2013 by a small group of students at the University of Texas at San Antonio to increase participation in local elections, and since then has gone on to become a statewide voter registration and engagement group. And the main purpose of our work at MOVE is to mobilize and organize young people to engage with all aspects of the political process and have their voices heard at the ballot box and beyond. We try to focus on building collective youth power from the ground up so that we can't be ignored and that we can build a future Texas that we all deserve.
Terrific. That's great. Alex, tell us a little bit about what you're hearing on the ground when you're talking to people. What are people's concerns? What are some of the issues that they're dealing with?
Yeah, for sure. So I was going to say, for some background, the county I manage is comprised of about 2 million people. So that's 10 cities/towns. And then there's also several college campuses and some with their own MOVE campus chapter programs. So it's my job to make sure that we're meeting young people where they are and facilitating the creation of civic infrastructure. And what that means is making electoral engagement more accessible through hosting voter registration drives, going into classrooms and registering voters, and encouraging students to have agency in their own organizing. And I think the number one takeaway that I've seen as like somebody that's been involved in this since I was 16 is that there is, I would say, like a new wave of interest in politics that goes way beyond the ballot box and goes into like more like community organizing, which I feel like is something that I would say is like neglected when we talk about like election cycles, but like what happens in the intermediate, what happens in the aftermath. And that is something that I would say people are focusing on more now, and for good reason.
And are you feeling, earlier on, Susan Scorbati mentioned talked about Gen Z, motivating Gen Z. Do you have a sense, are you feeling any momentum out there?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say generally young people, and this is something that is like documented and I feel well recorded, young people are less likely to align themselves with political parties. And again, I feel that that's like an outcome of continuous disappointment and feelings of disenfranchisement, and then actual like disenfranchisement in reality. I would say, again, there is momentum both for the ballot box, but again, more importantly, for actually building up community networks and supporting one another, like face to face and in person, like dedicating your time to volunteering, to delivering meals for people, to creating like mutual rideshare programs, those kinds of things that fully, sorry if you can hear my cat meowing in the background, but things that will fully support people beyond like the powers that be with like electoral politics in Texas.
Any questions for Alex? We have a question for Alex. Anybody? Susan, did you have your hand up? Okay, no, you go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick question, Alex. Great, wonderful to see you. Mostly we think about Texas as a red state. And so I think it's so impressive that you are working so hard in Texas to really organize and get, your age group out to the vote. Do you see Texas possibly going blue or purple, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I was going to say the organization I do work with is nonpartisan. And so when we look at the future of Texas, I would say that we're mostly looking along the lines of like whether or not young people are represented as opposed to like finding a goalpost in a certain political party. Because again, we are nonpartisan. The whole point is building up civic infrastructure that lasts generationally amongst young people and specifically young people of color. And I would say that that's the bigger and better goal.
Okay, I've final question. I know it's going to be good.
I hope it is. We've talked a lot tonight about getting informed and getting involved, and I think that's a perfect, if not the only, starting off point to meaningful change. And I think one thing that this generation especially, I feel, is missing is motivation. And I think the work you're doing sounds amazing and really exciting and motivating. I'm wondering if you have any advice on like just getting other people motivated to be in a room like this.
I would say, and this is coming from like someone that has done most of their organizing, I would say in like a hostile place when it comes to my beliefs and like what I would like to see in action. When it comes to motivating people, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So if you're talking about like Bennington, or if you're talking about like communities beyond that as well, even, part of mobilizing people and getting them to care about things, I think comes from information and education. Part of that comes like people, I think you don't have to explain to people that they are going through issues or that they can't afford to purchase their groceries. They can't afford to find like childcare. Some people don't have healthcare. You don't have to explain these things to people. But I think like a major point of connection is giving people the ability to air out those grievances and then be like, hey, this is actually like a step that you can take in the right direction depending on like what issue they're involved in or what issue they're interested in. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Great. Okay. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Next time, hopefully, we'll see you in person. And I would say if anybody here, students, guests, have somebody in another state that you would like us to talk to, let us know. We have some folks lined up, but if you have someone who's doing some interesting work, a parent, a friend, anyone, let us know.
Okay, so we're coming close to the end of the evening. But we want to, as I said, every class is going to have a plan for action. So our plan for action tonight, Abrar is going to come back up here and share with us his website, myballot.info, briefly. And we are hoping that everyone will then register, make sure that you have 10 people that you know who will register to vote, and that they will contact 10 more people to register to vote. So that's our goal. Maybe you're already doing that. Maybe your family and friends are registered or they're going to, but that's our goal, at least coming out of tonight, as much as possible that we can spread that and get as many people to register as possible. Abrar.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan. I just want to remind all of you that I cannot vote in the US, and I have created this website. So, yeah, so there are ways to engage, right? So the main goal of myballot.info is to make people to register to vote and just to have them the information's available easily. If any of you have navigated a government website, you know it's a mess. And there are like thousands of lines, like, I don't know, hundreds of hyperlinked something going somewhere that no one knows probably. So um, let's begin by looking at the Alabama election website FAQ page. So it should. Okay. Okay, so this is just scrolling up and down in that page, clicking on register, and then this registration page also have this bunch of hyperlinks. So you don't need this. So you have myballot.info. So this is what the website looks like. And can you go to the next slide, please? So this is what it looks like in a computer. And if you go to the next slide, this is what it looks like in the phone. So if you click on find your state, just having some technical issues, I guess. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the main page that you really need, is when you click on find my state, you have a drop-down menu and then you have a map. So you can select your state from the drop-down, or you can just click on the map. So this is where you come. So here you have all the links that you might need to register to vote, check your registration, check your ID requirements, check the deadlines. Everything is here. And when you click on the link, it just directly takes you to the registration page. No text, no hyperlinks, nothing. You just fill out your register to vote. And then we also have this voting information tool. So what this tool basically does is it takes information directly from your election office, matches that with your address that you put in here, and then gives you personalized information about your ballot. So it tells you where to vote, it tells you what's in your ballot, it tells you how do you connect to your local election office. And this is all through Google's Civic API. And the thing is, you'll probably ask me after this class, like, there are like thousands of platforms that does the same thing, or you can just Google it, or I don't know. The main difference, the reason you need myballot.info is, if you pay attention, we are not collecting any information. When you register to vote, we just redirect you to the form where you need to go to register to vote. We don't ask for your name, we don't ask for your emails, we do not save any of your informations. Even when you were putting the address is just connecting to a database that like matches your information, your address information, and then gives you your personalized information. So we are not storing anything in any ways. So the privacy is the main thing for myballot.info. So that does not mean that you don't need the details in the website. You do, and I'm working on an AI model that can answer your basic questions, even sometimes complex questions about elections. I'm just still experimenting with it because election information is very sensitive. So that being said, I just urge all of you to use it, take this opportunity, register, and cast your ballot. I said this when I welcomed everyone in this class, that it is very, very hard to rebuild a democracy. This election is crucial. And I have lost friends. I was in house arrest. Some of my friends are still in the hospital. I have seen it firsthand. So I'm just telling you, like, rebuilding a democracy is far more challenging than just simply casting your ballot and just to strengthen and sustain it. Let's just ensure that every voice is heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abar, and thank you to our alums and students, Marta and Samuel, Page and Abar, and for sharing your stories and really acting as real inspiration for those here who can vote and for all of us to get involved. I just want to share that my friends from graduate school and I get together every Tuesday night and write letters to people throughout the country asking them to vote. A small thing we can do, and it's also a lot of fun because we get to see each other. I also want to thank Susan for really shepherding this class, and Eileen, Brian, and Maurice for teaching. You will see more of them in the future, but I want to underscore what Abrar said. This is a really consequential election in our country and in the world. And if we can get educated and participate, if we can vote for the norms that we believe in and the values we believe in, and debate and discuss. And I really think what Richard said was so important. It's a time here when you're in college to do that, whether it's at 3 o'clock at night or, right after this class. That's what we should all be learning. To educate for democracy is what we're all about. So thank you very, very much.